Heat trembled above green courts, a shimmer that hid nothing. In the bleachers, a small girl's chest fluttered like a trapped bird, fingers clutching a pink ribbon gone slick with sweat. A janitor's hands, scarred, steady on most days, shook as an oximeter bled red numbers that fell like a countdown. Polished shoes paused mid-laugh. Champagne brightness curdled into murmurs. Cameras drifted like vultures, scenting spectacle before they glimpsed need. The world narrowed to thin breath, a father's pulse, a ribbon, a crowd they couldn't decide whether to watch or help. The scoreboard glowed indifferent, as if numbers could anchor a life. Somewhere beyond, leather-seated benefactors traded smirks about grit and public relations. On the baseline, a queen in white traced the service line with a single toe, satisfied with symmetry. The sun refused to blink. A heart refused to cooperate. Humiliation gathered like storm heat. The court had been staged as a charity tableau, scripted applause already priced into tomorrow's coverage. Power had a sound here, the hush before a serve, the rustle of silk, the manageable laugh of donors. At the center, Veronica Langley curated the world into clean angles and compliant outcomes. She played to win dividends, headlines, and deference. In the bleachers, executives leaned forward, eager for a ritual of dominance disguised as sport. The janitor sweeping leaves was a set piece, a reminder that order had a uniform and a broom. When her taunt carried over the public address, it arrived lacquered with entitlement, flashing teeth behind polite veneers. Phones lifted, eager to fossilize a moment that would travel farther than any serve. The crowd craved a spectacle with a sanctioned loser. The air thickened with expectation. Far from the lines, a little girl swallowed hard.
The broom fell with a clink that cut through curated laughter, an unbeautiful sound in a place trained toward grace. Calloused fingers closed around a spare racket with the same economy they used on mops and drains. Boots scuffed a surface lacquered for white-soled shoes. Some in the crowd grinned, scenting a harmless diversion before the champagne. Others leaned back, smug in the certainty that hierarchies are sturdier than wrists. The janitor crossed the painted threshold like a man stepping into his own rumor, every eye await, every camera a verdict prepared in advance. His gaze never sought approval, it searched only for a small face gone pale among bright dresses and shaded hats. The net sagged slightly in summer heat. The ball boy hesitated, sensing the tremor before a shift. Status made room for sport. Sport prepared to make room for consequence. Silence can be loud when money is listening. Veronica tossed the ball into a perfect column of light and met it with curated ferocity, a prophecy disguised as physics. Strings sang the notes successful people expect from the universe. Across the net, something unadvertised happened. Feet set like a craftsman's stance. Hips loaded. Racket turned forward with a whisper that disrespected panic. The return didn't argue. It stitched the baseline clean as a tailor's last pass, kissed chalk, and stood judgment on balance sheets and belief. Laughter snapped shut. The applause that followed went nowhere, trapped in lungs that hadn't decided if they'd witnessed luck or literacy. In 3 points, cameras abandoned donors and discovered hunger. In 5, rich whispers invented explanations that wouldn't bruise self-regard. Veronica's pulse rode a faster beat under silk. The janitor's breath stayed ordinary. The girl watched, forgetting to be afraid.
Not everyone came for cocktails and curated mercy. One set of eyes had chased patterns for a living, mapping stances to careers, backswings to destinies. From the shade of a press row, a reporter marked the slight open hip, the economical split step, the way contact arrived early as if time paid rent to muscle memory. The name he remembered lived in headlines smudged with old hope and fresh tragedy. He tasted a story more valuable than a corporate grudge. Phones around him continued swallowing video, but his pen etched something messier. Debt, loss, disappearance, rumor. The court glittered with money's confidence. The man in boots threaded points like wire into a frame strong enough to hold a life. The reporter smiled without softness. Heroes convert well, villains better. He smelled blood in the water and photo lights behind the horizon. He waited for collapse. Momentum isn't mysterious when fundamentals are honest. Footwork reduced waste. Vision borrowed fractions of seconds from players who lived on highlights. Veronica's weapons returned stamped insufficient, not cruelly, simply fact. The crowd recalibrated laughter into caution, then into uneasy wonder. The janitor learned nothing new. He only remembered where to put his weight. A bag of tricks for rich afternoons emptied into geometry. Spin unsettled privilege. Placement ignored etiquette. The scoreboard trailed reality by a point, then two, then a game. Veronica adjusted like a professional. More pace, sharper angles, higher toss. The ritual of control. The court declined to cooperate. Faces that had smirked now studied, then betrayed awe. The little girl's oximeter steadied a whisper. Humiliation arrived without spectacle, built from tiny correct choices repeated under pressure. The line between performance and survival thinned until it felt like string at the throat.
All the small cruelties that travel with power assembled in Veronica's chest and found no oxygen of their own. 5 games stood on the board like witnesses, the 6th crouched in the near future, a shape made of silence and headlines. Investors know a bagel when they see one. It's a number that becomes a narrative that becomes cost. Veronica's second serve wavered, the ball a little heavy, the arm a little late. A junior line judge watched his hand shake and hit it behind procedure. The janitor's recovery step drew a neat arc, an artist's flourish he hadn't earned with lessons or club dues, but with repetition that outlasted pain. In the good seats, smiles bristled into defense. Someone crafted a joke about rings and charity. No one laughed. The pink ribbon in the bleachers brightened in the sun, a small flag refusing surrender. Information travels fastest when it has teeth. Between changeovers, a whisper slid along benches and past programs, shedding empathy as it moved. The purse wore a philanthropic suit. No cash, no check, only a directed donation with neat tax language to keep hands clean and optics cleaner. The janitor's shoulders hitched, barely, a mechanical adjustment to a load that had just become heavier. The racket felt normal. The math did not. Surgery required a number that respectability couldn't consider tidy. The crowd approved of generosity, provided it didn't sweat. Inside this machinery, a father counted breaths. Privilege polished motives on the way to brunch. Across the net, Veronica saw the knowledge land and felt an ugly comfort rise, then wither. Some victories wrought in the hand. The ball boy's toss looked like pity. The next point started anyway. The oximeter and the bleachers blinked impatiently.
The child's cough sliced through etiquette, stripped logo walls, and made the afternoon honest. Numbers bled bad news across a tiny screen, the kind that instructs hands to move without permission. The racket became a useless tool for breaking a different kind of distance. 1 step, 2, 3, a father crossed from spectacle to duty, reaching the only line that mattered. The crowd watched humanity do a basic thing and called it disruption. Sweat gathered under wealth. Veronica saw a truth she had designed life to avoid. There are emergencies where money waits its turn like everyone else. Her throat tightened with heat that wasn't anger. The sun pressed harder. The scoreboard hung like an accusation and a joke. The girl tried to breathe around fear and air that refused to cooperate. Protocols trembled and then learned how to run. A parking lot entered the plot. Sometimes the fastest path to mercy runs through arrogant machinery. Leather welcomed panic, and an engine converted regret into forward motion. Painted arrows surrendered to tires that ignored their calm advice. In the rearview mirror, a child's pulse fluttered under a father's palm, and a lullaby without tune anchored breath to breath. City lights divided into green wishes and red obstacles. The world, which had been calibrated to status, suddenly recognized triage as the only credential that matters. Veronica's hands, blessed by favorable markets, learned to grip a wheel like it was the last honest instrument left. Horns complicated routes. Asphalt groaned under urgency. The charity banners by the exit looked small now, like souvenirs from a lie. Inside the car, time stretched thin.
Each second a wire carried between 3 people who could not afford to drop it. The hospital finally appeared, unadorned and merciless.
Institutions ask questions even when answers sweat. Fluorescent light flattened everyone into tired faces and forms. A clerk practiced fairness by requesting proof that pain could pay. Lines forged from accident and inevitability shuffled toward outcomes. A father hovered between apology and insistence, holding a small hand and all the history it contained. Veronica stepped forward with the only credential this desk understood, then signed in ink that felt heavier than contracts she had once considered monumental. The paper accepted responsibility without sentiment. Behind a curtain, machines found rhythm where bodies had lost it. The air tasted of bleach and hope, equally thin. The court's audience had become a nurse, a tech, a stooped volunteer refilling cups. Wealth learned to stand without a stage. The janitor stared at a plastic chair and decided not to collapse into it. He kept count of breaths instead. The words arrived steady, as if steadiness could substitute for comfort. Complex congenital anatomy. Scar tissue. Oxygen debt unpaid across months. A surgery both rare and experimental, with a window that shrank the longer adults argued. There was a slot because other children also needed miracles that could not be scheduled at will. Numbers crawled across estimates with a chill precision that never met a mop bucket or a grave. A father's world narrowed to a promised chance guarded by gatekeepers who feared headlines more than failure. A woman who had trained her empire to respond to her shadow discovered the limits of shadows in rooms where machines glowed blue and green. Outside, rain considered whether to fall. Inside, the doctor's eyes carried years of first names. The day retreated to the corners and waited to see what pride and money would do with urgency.
Grief wears many costumes. Today, it chose fury that didn't shout. Anger knows the shape of unfairness better than eloquence. A father counted how a public dare had rented his child's safety to strangers and cameras. Resentment opened its mouth, found no words that could match the raw arithmetic of hospital monitors, and closed again. Across the room, the architect of humiliation stood stripped of scripts, discovering a flavor of shame that boardrooms do not serve. She reached for logistics and found that the only logistics that mattered were breaths per minute. The waiting room clock insisted on its schedule. A janitor who could measure distance in footwork and inches now measured it in doors he could not open without permission. The ribbon lay curled in his fist like a promise he had no right to make. Rain finally committed to the glass. The first headline struck like a steel door closing in a hallway of options. Words rearranged the afternoon into tidy outrages and simple roles. A queen in white, a working man with a secret, a child with a heart that couldn't argue with spin. The piece asked easy questions with expensive punctuation. Comments processed pain into sport, eager to pick teams before facts caught breath. Phones in conference rooms hummed. Investors counted not hearts, but sentiment. The reporter tasted traffic and approval, and something older and less noble. Somewhere between editors and algorithms, the child became leverage. The court where money liked to rehearse grace became a stage for a trial whose verdict was engagement. The hospital waited, unimpressed. The janitor kept his chair empty, unable to sit. The woman who had once curated outcomes watched a narrative sprint beyond her control.
Power never wastes a stumble. At an address that loved glass and views, men and women who praised prudence sharpened it into a blade. A meeting convened with words about stewardship and reputation. Slides showed sanitized outrage and carefully anonymized sources, all syllables purchased with old ambitions. Emotion drafted itself with the speed of grievance. The accusation wasn't complicated. Leadership had become liability. The defense would be expensive. Some faces wore satisfaction they would deny under oath. The number of votes firmed like ice. The city beyond the windows separated into tiny, solvable problems that none of these people would touch with their hands.
The woman at the center of their arithmetic stood alone in a hospital hallway, her heels silent for once. She had spent a life preparing for knives. She had not prepared for a child's breath to measure her courage. Truth has a way of choosing its time. Files that once slept woke under the wrong light, their sentences framed by malice and curiosity. A promising career paused by metal and blood. A marriage that didn't survive a red light that refused to confess. A father who learned how to fold his life into shifts that matched clinics and pharmacy windows. The rumor that greatness had cowardice in its DNA found purchase among those who preferred their heroes simple and their fall guys simpler. The man in the plastic chair refused to answer questions he hadn't been asked. He kept his attention on a curtain that moved when a nurse entered and when hope left. Old photos in someone else's archive became weapons in rooms he couldn't enter. The ribbon in his hand refused to relax. It belonged to a small chest now claiming air more evenly.
Follow money long enough and it introduces its old grudges. A sponsorship that once painted billboards learned spite when fate rewrote the script. The hand behind the coup hid in trusts and proxies, but paper leaves clues when it forgets to sweat. Contracts that had looked like partnerships now read like mortgages on dignity. The woman who trained numbers to heal followed signatures through mazes until they arranged themselves into a familiar name with a taste for punishment. Revenge had dressed up as governance and found willing couriers. In a quiet office, a printout whispered about settlements, threats, and a campaign to convert tragedy into leverage. Outside, a volunteer pushed a cart of blankets past families who didn't know they were background to corporate theater. A plan sharkened in Veronica's mind that had nothing to do with survival and everything to do with a promise. Some choices arrive already priced. Ink found paper again, this time forming a document that neutered every comfortable defense left. A resignation letter waited in a folder, a key capable of opening two doors, one toward a child's chance, one toward a quiet that could resemble defeat. Phone calls mapped influence. Conversations traded reputation for access without bargaining chips. The surgical slot moved from maybe to held, pinned there by leverage that would cost more than money. Pride argued its old case. Conscience answered in a voice that sounded like a small girl laughing in a park that didn't exist yet. On a bench, a janitor studied shoes that had once belonged to a better year. The woman who had built a life on winning assembled a plan that could end hers. The letter slept like a loaded instrument, awaiting a stage and a minute.
The corridor where linoleum recorded panic and patience received a quieter collision. Secrets didn't need volume to bruise. A father who had lived inside control learned that gratitude can be cruel when it asks for tribute in the currency of identity. He calculated the cost of help paid in headlines and vows, then tried to refuse a lifeline because pride wears armor he'd polished for years. The woman who had authored humiliation bore it now like penance, steady but not numb. Plans met fear. The child behind the curtain breathed like someone who wanted a future. The storm outside lost interest. The world inched toward night. The next decision would either cripple two lives or save one. When love and ruin stand beside each other, breath decides before logic can register protest. Silence weighed the hallway and found nowhere soft to land. The curtain stirred again. The choice didn't dress itself up. It arrived sober, hand extended, demanding truth in front of a lens that forgives nothing. A father who had hidden from limelight understood that hiding had become a luxury his child could not afford. A woman who had perfected power learned what it meant to spend it without keeping a receipt. The plan crystallized. Speak plainly. Refuse euphemism.
accept pain. Aim the story at those who confuse charity with absolution. The city hunkered under evening. The hospital accepted another emergency in a different room with equal seriousness. A production assistant rehearsed calm in a studio humming with electricity. Somewhere, a board counted votes it believed already won. Somewhere else, a surgeon reviewed schedules and risks, pencil tapping like a metronome. Resolve settled over two people who had started the day as adversaries and now shared a single measure of time.
Air behaves differently under studio lamps. It grows dense, becomes an element that must be navigated. Chairs that look soft in rehearsal stiffened. Microphones waited to convert hesitations into signals, then into judgments. The city's appetite for redemption simmered under a surface designed for outrage. A producer counted down with fingers that had sent 1,000 strangers into rebirth or ruin. In a hospital wing, a nurse adjusted a child's blanket and checked numbers that might someday feel ordinary. A board member refreshed a feed and found hands sweating against polished wood. The set smelled of cosmetics and metal. Two people took their places, each bracing against a different storm with the same goal held between them. Before the light turned red, there was a half-breath where fear and courage occupied the same seat. Then the world arrived in pixels and expectation. Surprises sharpen in rooms with perfect audio. A contract excerpt swam onto a screen with language that prefers cold weather, prohibitions, conflicts, breaches. Funding beyond defined channels would trigger consequences designed by past committees who feared scandal more than harm. The implication was tidy. Charity could cost the throne. Viewers leaned forward. They recognized high-wire acts even without a poll. The woman at the center did not reach for outrage. She lifted a quiet that sounded like accountability. The father beside her closed his hands until knuckles considered protest, then released. He understood that help can require blood when the world is made of paperwork and performances. Across the city, arguments began forming in texts that would harden into votes by morning. In a hospital room, a small machine hummed indifferently, loyal only to measured breath. The segment moved on, but the trap remained open.
When a man abandons myth, he becomes legible. The studio's brightness turned crowds into one listener, an imagined friend who knows the difference between failure and sacrifice. Words laid out a road not taken and the one chosen instead, paved with clinics, night shifts, and lullabies that never asked for applause. There had been talent. There had been a door slammed by metal and grief. There had been a wife whose music taught silence how to mean something. In that silence, a father learned to trade arenas for hallways and sponsorships for appointment slips. The confession did not beg, it reported. The cameras, hungry for scandal, found something less profitable and more difficult. Ordinary devotion. In living rooms and on phones, people who had never touched a racket heard themselves anyway. The story tightened its focus until numbers and names blurred around a child's breath. Momentum performs acrobatics when honesty lands clean. Metrics, allergic to sincerity on most days, surrendered to it in real time. Feeds that had warmed to outrage pivoted toward recognition. Investors with dashboards discovered a lag that money couldn't excise: human reaction. Hashtags unspooled like rescue ropes, some trite, some tender, most clumsy but pointed in the right direction. The board's tidy calculus developed hairline fractures under pressure from screens in pockets and spouses at kitchen tables. At a hospital window, city lights stacked like futures. A nurse changed a line with the unceremonious grace that saves lives. In the studio, the air relaxed a notch, the way rooms do when they've told a truth without collapsing. The reporter who had lit the first match refreshed his page and tasted ash. The segment prepared to close. The work, suddenly, felt possible.
Some promises cut both giver and receiver. The words she chose came unglazed, unmarketed, the way apologies should travel when they intend to live. Debt has more than one ledger. Hers had collected interest in a currency only humility could pay. She named the cost and accepted it without the ceremony power prefers. The studio did not erupt. It inhaled, then held the breath a beat longer than habit. Across the city, a signature at the bottom of a letter cooled to inevitability, if required. In a building with a view, a man with ambitions swore into a glass of something aged. In a hospital, a monitor traced steadier hills. Pride didn't vanish. It stepped back to make space for obligation. The world, which had introduced them as predator and prey, now studied two people sharing risk like a bridge. The light on the camera went dark. Morning assembled its courtiers in a room that believed in history only when it propped up decisions already made. Documents waited to be consecrated as outcomes. Phones lay face down, a pretense of focus. Eyes cheated. The first motion launched itself, confident, then faltered when facts refused to wear costumes. Collusion exposed itself neatly on paper, the way guilt does when arrogance forgets protocol. Proxies that had worn respect parted their coats to reveal a familiar sponsor. The room's temperature adjusted downward. A woman stood without theatrics and did not plea. She accounted. The vote, scheduled to travel in one direction, learned about friction. The old guard disguised as reformers discovered how quickly a narrative, once set ablaze, can wander home with a different flag. The city blinked. The company remained. The lesson, for those willing to learn, sharpened like a blade that prefers light.
Public words work only when they address the people who kept a place alive. The lobby filled with uniforms that knew bleach, freight, heat, and the rhythm of thankless tasks. Cameras drifted, expecting performance. Something quieter arrived. The apology did not outsource responsibility or recruit euphemism. It named harm, acknowledged habits, promised changes that could be measured without PowerPoint. The building listened through vents and stairwells. Managers shifted under the weight of what accountability asks when it stops posing. Some faces were skeptical. Skepticism is wisdom's favorite coat. Others softened despite themselves, because contrition can land like rain on a roof that forgot it was thirsty. The janitor stood in the back, invisible by training, present by choice. He counted not words but the absence of vanity. The day exhaled. Somewhere upstairs, old portraits felt less important. Institutions often grow from a single refusal to let one story end in the predictable place. A foundation took shape with governance designed to outlive sentiment. Its mission read harsher than hope and kinder than marketing. No child waits because paperwork likes to rehearse. Money poured in from spectacle, then was disciplined into pipelines that touched clinics far from headlines. The director wasn't a figurehead, but a man trained by necessity to wring waste from motion. He built programs where play rehabilitated, where breath learned trust through movement, where victories were measured in blocks walked without fear. The check that had once been the dream became a seed rather than a trophy. The woman who had authored Scandal brought resources and kept distance where pride requires dignity. The ribbon was pinned to a corkboard in a modest office, a relic and a compass.
Recovery prefers quiet milestones over parades. Weeks later, a park accepted new footsteps and laughter that didn't test its edges. A small scar flashed like a secret badge beneath a collar, unashamed of the war it recorded. The father watched with a reverence that owed no debt to an arena. He measured success in stray grass on shoes, in a chased ball, in a face flushed by weather instead of panic. The city moved around them, oblivious and generous in equal parts. Hospitals carried on saving strangers. Boardrooms returned to numbers with slightly better manners. The girl inhaled without consulting machines. A leaf fell, unphotographed, perfect in its own small way. The past didn't vanish. It negotiated a truce with a future that finally had room. The ribbon lived in her hair again, less like a talisman, more like a promise kept. Evening lay long shadows across an empty court that looked different when no one needed to win. Lines brightened under a small brush moved by hands that used to sign only deals. Dust rose, apologetic, then settled into order. A racket rested against the post, its strings relaxed, its work honorable and complete. The man who once haunted arenas stood with the comfortable quiet of someone who no longer owed those ghosts tribute. The air cooled into a kind of mercy. From a pocket the ribbon emerged, soft, patient, familiar. It tied easily around the net's edge, not as a trophy, not as a claim, simply as a reminder that games can be arenas for cruelty or openings for grace. Somewhere a child slept without bargaining for breath.